Welcome everyone to this live episode of SuiteScript Stories. I am your host, one of your hosts, Eric Grubaugh. And as always, I'm joined by Tim, my co-host.
Hi, everyone.
And yeah, today we have a very special guest. Sam Hornstein is the owner and CEO of eXtendTech, a NetSuite. You know what? I'm going to let Sam describe it.
Sure. Well, we've changed a little bit over the years, but we are a SDN or Suite Development Network partner. And basically, we have some Suite apps, and that's our spot in the NetSuite ecosystem.
Great. And we will definitely be picking into that, looking at what you guys are doing, how you're going about it, and hopefully get some interesting topics from that. Real quick at the top, this episode, this live episode, is hosted and sponsored by Salto. Thank you very much, Salto. Salto is not a consulting firm looking to sell you services. They have actually built a powerful DevOps platform for SuiteScript developers, just like you and me, to manage, track, and deploy our customizations across multiple environments. So if you are still struggling with bundles, perhaps, or keep putting off learning SDF, which you should not, go check out salto.io to sign up for free and request a demo. And with that, Tim, I'm going to kick it over to you.
All right. So thanks. So before we get started, I want to say I'm really happy that we're doing this again. I've been looking forward to kind of getting back in the swing of things with the podcast and now the webinar. Eric, thank you for asking me to get involved way back in the day. I think it was late 2020 that you and I were chatting one day, and you're like, "Hey, would you be interested in doing this?" And here we are, and we're back. So thank you, and thanks also to Salto, and thanks to Sam for agreeing to be our first guest as part of I guess I was calling it the reboot. I first met Sam back in 2017. It's been a long time. It seems like a long time. And he was kind of instrumental in introducing me to NetSuite, kind of helping me figure out like what it was, and got me all pumped up and excited about it. So Sam, thank you for that. And thank you for agreeing to do this. At the time that I met Sam, I was actually working for a promotional products company, and we're going to talk a little bit about how Sam's work has kind of been focused to a large degree in that space, but not entirely. But for now, let me introduce Sam. Welcome, Sam. Thanks again for doing this.
Hey, Tim, thank you. And thank you guys. I mean, I was an original SuiteScript Stories listener during the throes of the pandemic. So it was very comforting, and there were some familiar faces or familiar voices on those as well. So always appreciate what you guys have been doing with the environment and developing a sense of community. So thank you guys for creating the thoughtful content and also the contributions you make to the whole universe, because I know you guys are quite active on the boards and supporting people with some of the NetSuite technologies. So I can just express my gratification for you guys contributing to the community that's out there for the NetSuite environment.
Oh, thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
So, one of the first things I wanted to get into with you is, I think you had told me at one point that your first NetSuite experience was all the way back in 2003. Is that right? It's like a long time ago.
Yeah, I feel like a NetSuite dinosaur at times, but I had worked for a couple large advertising agency conglomerates and these publicly traded companies, and we had budgets out the wazoo, and people would do all of this work for us, and we'd have all these what were then sophisticated tools to be able to execute those objectives. And then I moved into a very small niche specialty paint company, and they wanted me to do some marketing for them. And I was like, okay, well, where's your customer database? And they didn't have that. And then I was like, well, show me your transactional database. And they didn't have that. And, I just signed up for a job where I had to build an extension on a house, and I didn't have the house built. So I was already oriented to web technologies, and, being that long ago, bandwidth was not really even physically available, and we all weren't connected with our devices. So I said, I don't want to look after a computer and do tape backups and create some local application. Let me see if there's some applications out there that have that database, and I can manage the customers and the transactions. And it led me to this product called NetLedger back in 2003. And I said, well, let's give that a shot, and convinced my boss that we should probably sign up for this thing to manage the business. And that's where all my hair fell out shortly thereafter, because, even then, when the product was as small and as simple as it was back in the day, it was still pretty complex for coming into it. And just for background, I don't have a development background. I've always been just a power user analyst, and like to figure things out. So NetSuite at that time, and still today, is a pretty powerful tool to achieve some of those things that we accomplished with those large companies, but at the time was very affordable for a small company. So I felt it was a competitive advantage to have a tool like NetSuite in a small company, when the only place you could find those kind of sophisticated functionality was with these large enterprise organizations or with large budgets. So that's kind of what got me into NetSuite to begin with. And, I was saying to you earlier, there was no API at that time. Customization within NetSuite didn't really exist, and you had to use it directly out of the box for what it had to do. So that whole world has changed over the years, as you guys can attest to. But I'll tell you, it really gained familiarity with the fundamentals of the NetSuite architecture, because it's still present in today's iteration of NetSuite, believe it or not. So
whenever I see NetLedger in an error message, I know I'm working in some OG parts of NetSuite.
So it's still all there in the background at some point, but that was the discovery. And doing I couldn't find implementation partners. There weren't people who perform services. So it was essentially the short list of help docs that were available, and then trial and error is what got it to become a successful solution for the business I was working for.
Wow. It's hard for me to imagine a point in time where NetSuite wasn't customizable to some extent. And because I got into it so late in the game, I still feel like a newbie. So
we could do the custom fields, and we could do all the custom records. I don't know if custom records were even available at the time, but I know custom fields were. So it's come a long way. And then, just doing it and using it every day. And then the next company I worked for some reason recommended they try NetSuite as well. And that became my project again. But as time went on, you could start to do a few little things when it comes to customization. And once I did get my hands on a developer, I felt like a kid in a candy store at that point, because all of those limitations that I was banging my head against the wall were now opened up as new possibilities.
Yeah, I think what makes your, Eric and I have referred to this before as sort of someone's NetSuite journey, if you will. And I think what makes your journey so interesting is that you went from being a user to a power user to someone who started recommending NetSuite and implementing it, all the way up to today, where you're running a company that essentially is developing solutions. And so all that, and I looked at your LinkedIn today for the first time in a really long time, and I looked at what your education was. You were a psychology major, and then here you are today running a tech company. Did you ever in a million years imagine that you'd be doing something like this, or are you just as surprised at how you got here as anyone else?
I mean, I never would have thought that. The Bachelor of Science in Psychology, and even how I think today, I still stick to the scientific method. And I have a ton of hypotheses that I feel like I need to prove. NetSuite seems to be the platform to conduct the experiments with. So I look at it in that kind of scenario, which is, I believe that this company or this practice could be more efficient if we were to perform X, Y, and Z, and then orchestrate the experiment. And, the real key, which I consider myself very thankful for, is that in conducting any experiment, you need a statistically relevant audience size, right? And, when you work for one company and you come up with a hypothesis and you create the experiment, if they decide not to adopt, or, one person says it's not going to work, then that's not really validation on if the idea was good or not. I need more folks. So the opportunity to be able to work with all these different types of companies and to put forth these things in that type of experiment allows you to validate, hey, maybe that idea is valuable, but it's not, nothing's 100% for everybody, right? So that's where I feel like the evolution, and the point you mentioned too, which I always pay very close attention to with the folks we work with, is being a customer and an actual user and practitioner of NetSuite is a pretty unique position versus someone who's never run a business or has worked in a warehouse or has been grime up to their elbows picking units off of a shelf and trying to think, how can I make this easier? How can I find things quicker? So a lot of today's practice and a lot of NetSuite professionals are only dealing with the theoretical, and they've never had to perform the work. So I find that we're a lot more in tune with the requirements that we're working with these companies because we've had to physically perform the work and solve for those challenges firsthand rather than just in theory.
Yeah, so I think that's a good segue into, I think Extend Files was your first Suite app, is that right? And was that sort of born out of your own, like, boy, I wish this existed? Or like, how did that come to be, and how did you sort of make the transition into, developing those and then eventually starting eXtendTech? Tell us about that if you don't mind.
Sure. I mean, in full disclosure, I was working with heavy files in the organizations that I was employed at, and we were using the box.com integration, which was powerful at the time, but I felt like it wasn't truly embedded native NetSuite, right? It was an iframe that was kind of like, it didn't speak to one another. You could initiate certain things, but it wasn't fully harmonized. And even I remember reaching out to developers, reaching out to Box, trying to find a bridge to make it fully harmonized, and then just conceptualized, man, it would be great if I could drag a file straight into NetSuite, push that to a repository, and then work with that file in save searches and run queries, do different views, and take certain functions that were required for the employer that I was with. So it was always a wish list to build a repository connection so I could have, me being the power user, I want to run a save search, I want to find files, I want to preview them, I want to be able to share them, and I wanted it automatically joined to all the records that it's associated with. So that was always kind of a hankering that I had to address. And then when I decided to endeavor on an independent venture, it was the first thing I needed to knock out. So maybe on not so dissimilar to how the rest of the world works, but I went out on LinkedIn and was looking for NetSuite developers, which was a very much smaller universe than it is today, and started reaching out to just make inquiries to see if people were interested in doing a project and following an idea. And that's kind of where it led. And, in the beginning, it was just, hey, here's an AWS connection, from NetSuite Direct. And, what it's evolved into is, well, if you use Azure or Gmail or, Google Drive or SharePoint or Box or Dropbox. So we didn't really want you to feel restricted to use a prescribed solution. And then also just to support a lot of different functions of what would be considered a document management solution. But to be clear, it started with, I need to manage these chunky artwork files that, aren't uploading properly, or they may be 15 megs, or they might be 150 megs. And, there were limitations related to that. So the solution was geared around a highly transactional, highly file dependent business practice. And then being able, like, we added things to convert files. So if you stick an AI file in there, it will render an image. Or if you need to render PDFs or vector files for what our micro vertical is working with so frequently. So that's kind of the evolution of extend files. And, we continue to iterate and even go back and say, man, we should have, thought about that a little bit differently when we first started. But that is, inevitable, right?
Yes. I'm curious about how eXtendTech has evolved along with, say, Extend Files, and I'm sure your other apps too. So you started out, you are looking for anyone on LinkedIn, to what is it now? What do the operations look like? What's the development team look like? How's everything structured?
That's a great question. When we actually first started it, I started it as a solution provider, that's one of the partner types within the NetSuite universe. And, quite rudimentary thinking is I was like, well, a lot of people come to me to ask about NetSuite. So I figure, hey, I can, and people call me in to help orient people in the sales cycle. So I figured, hey, I might as well resell NetSuite. But then I realized that that's a whole different beast in general, right? I mean, aside from a whole bunch of other folks out there in the universe trying to be a VAR for NetSuite, you also see NetSuite selling directly, and that wasn't the right fit for our expertise and our experience. So we made a shift several years ago to just focus in on the applications and in the suite develop the SDN program. And over the course of where we've been around, it started with just myself and a developer that I had on contract to build the first app, to just, I would say that I have a pretty big appetite or ambition to create different gap filling things that I've experienced over the years. So I would continue to say, well, could we build this and could we build that? And then my development partner would say, well, I could use some help with all the things you want to build. So I said, fine, let's bring in some more folks to help us develop all of these ambitions. And then, fast forward to today, I still have a big laundry list of things that I'd like to develop and things I would like to improve upon. We probably have a team of about 17 folks who are working in different capacities. And as we've learned as well, it takes good documentation and support and being able to self-serve, because one of the key things that we stand by is we want you to be able to take the tool and run with it. We don't want it to be too complex to understand, but we really know NetSuite administrators and developers out there don't want to have a tool that's rigid or they can't customize on top of, or, so I do look at them as utilities rather than full boat applications. And while they might be pretty feature specific in certain ways, we try to keep them open and flexible in the way that we architect them. So any developer or administrator can adopt them in their own way. Like, even for an example of extend files, it is a native NetSuite custom record and it's unlocked. So if you want to add fields to it or tie things into it, your core utility of getting that file into the record, out to the repository and backseated within the environment is there, but then you can take it to whatever direction you'd like to take it. And that's fundamental to how we think about things, because I always wanted the ability to create within my own environment, but I needed certain utilities to get me there. And that's even to your question of asking about where did extend files start? It was like, give me the utility to drive that into the repository and I'll take it from there. because I don't know where we're going to go from that point forward. But as long as I can do that part, I'm unblocked.
Very cool. So Extend Files was your first Suite app, and I know that you have a number of different apps now. I was looking at the site or your site earlier. It's even some that I wasn't aware of until today. But one of the ones that has caught my attention is Extend Mobile, and I'm really curious to hear the story of how that came to be. But can you talk to us a little bit first? Tell us what that is, because I think it's really interesting what you're doing there.
Yeah, no problem. We love Extend Mobile, and it was kind of born out of that same principle of being able to choose your own adventure without going back to development to request certain functions and format. So it really was born right before the pandemic. We were doing a industry specific trade show, and I had always had this thought of, man, I would like to scan the badge and call out to a third-party data service that I was hooked up to and pull the data down and then flip a few parameters and push that into NetSuite, and it would create an order or it would trigger a workflow. And I can, say the moment I scan your badge, you get an email, and that's some of the power of what NetSuite can do as far as that instant action and event. So we were creating this scanning app for this trade show, and my development team was like, well, what do you want the form to look like? And what fields should we have on there? And how should they map? And I said, I don't know. I mean, I could tell you what I want now, but I might change my mind later. And I kind of joked that Extend Mobile was born out of both indecision and procrastination, because now I was like, why don't you give me the opportunity to just create my own form and choose my own fields and move them wherever I want them to be moved. So within the mobile application itself, you can target a NetSuite record and query all the fields that are available for it and start popping fields down into the form and then moving them around, defaulting or hard coding those things. And it's all happening within the mobile interface. So you can execute and create these functions all within mobile, and it can connect to any record that's inside NetSuite. So, when you talk about what can it do, it's more about, the users out there that wish they had an ability to hand a user to pull up some data related to a record and make updates and post it back. This is kind of one of those quick utilities where you can be very targeted about what is that user going to do, what data do they need to see, and what do we need to capture from them, and then deploy that to a group of users in a pretty efficient manner. So Extend Mobile to me is yet another platform or utility where you get it and you open it up and it's a blank screen, which doesn't feel great. But, the key is, hey, am I in a CRM function? Am I doing a work order function where I need to add components on the fly? So, one client who uses mobile, they've got a group of people who are on the road, and they're a landscaping company, and they need to go buy materials every day from a series of vendors when they're driving around, and they need to give those vendors a PO. So they'll go on site, they'll open up a PO, say the materials they're purchasing, hit submit, get a PO number back, give it to the vendor, and now when the bills show up, they can reconcile it against the PO. Or as I mentioned to you, we've got a Belgian solar company that does these solar installation projects, and they wanted to record photographs of every step. They want to get the wiring, they want to get the roof, they want to get the runs of the wires. So they pull up a project record and they start opening up the camera and taking photographs and qualifying those photographs and saving them to the project. So the diversity of what Extend Mobile can achieve is really what gets me excited, and then finding all the different use cases where it can be applied, because people are deploying it to their vendors, right? They'll create a a series of records in NetSuite, and they'll be filtered to the vendor. Now the vendor logs in, sees a list of things they need to do. They can drill down to the purchase order, and they can update statuses on things being produced. So it's really facilitating the distribution of your information to your trading partners or your employees, and trying to do it in a very lean and not so like challenging way or time-consuming way.
It's really interesting. When you first put that out, I think it was only for Android, right? And
Yes.
just recently you got approval from Apple. It's in the App Store for iOS. Was that, and I know that you're not the developer, but I'm sure you were hearing it from your developers. Like, was it more of a challenge for one platform or the other? And what was the approval process like? Because you hear horror stories about that sometimes.
Well, it was certainly a little more, prior to getting it published, just the distribution of the application was a bit more challenging in the Apple environment than it was in the Android environment, just due to test flight and some of the distribution pieces, or getting those IDs set so you could distribute it. But I would say that the actual application and approval process wasn't super painful. It was just understanding what we needed to do to prep and follow those new instructions. It did start with Android, and that was probably just due to the fact that it was a little easier for entry when we were doing the development. And yes, it is on the Google Play Store, and it is in the App Store for iTunes as well, and it's in BFN review as well. So it's been an interesting journey with that. But as I was mentioning, like, look, the first iteration of it, everything was God mode, right? Like, any user could go in and change any record or connect to any record, and there were no limitations on what it could be done. So as things become a little dangerous, or I think sometimes when we do our development, I say, we go full bore. Can it do it, regardless of if it's practical for everybody to be able to do it, and then reel it in, rather than trying to lock it down and figure out how we can give functionality to certain people. So it's just a different approach to it. But yeah, it started with this little local app that we had on a couple of our devices. And when we first did that scanning, we did do it for iPhone as well. So we were kind of footed in both technologies to begin with, but we never made it official or had the distribution, and just found working with Android was a little bit easier for us to iterate and distribute when it was in dev. I hope that answered the question you asked. I tend to go off on tangents at times.
No, it definitely did. Has the adoption been better on one platform or the other? Like, can you tell yet, or is it still too soon to tell?
No, I mean, I think it's really just a matter of user preferences and orientation. I mean, I know you've always been an Apple guy, and that's kind of your orientation. And then some folks are, stick their flag in the ground for Android. And so, exactly. So, but not the youth of today, apparently, because it's a status thing. But, I feel like adoption-wise, look, our objective is to ensure that whether you're using an iOS device or an Android device, this user experience is the same, and you're able to do the same stuff. So that's, from our perspective, the most important part. And then it's just a matter of what are you already carrying around in your pocket, because it should work for that.
Very cool.
Yeah, I do have one question I think I can interject here from Nadeem. Are your Suite apps, do you build them all natively, or are you leveraging middleware? How are you talking to NetSuite typically with something like mobile?
We do a bunch of hybrid Suite apps, which means, it's not all native, but because we have a few published Suite apps, and we have a pretty large library of, I would say, non-published Suite apps. So dependent on the functionality that we're performing, my first default and what I would like to do every time is be native, right? And there's plenty of methods you can do to stay native, and I don't know if NetSuite will get mad for the anonymous suitelet type of thing, but a lot of people deploy anonymous suitelets as a way to externally share things, but still keep it native. But then we do have a couple different services that we tie into some of our suite apps that are dependent on third-party services. For example, Tim had mentioned we have a micro vertical focus in the promotional products industry, and a lot of things that we offer there are integrations between third parties. So like NetSuite can't host endpoints per se because of, so we have to kind of interject ourselves sometimes to give certain endpoints or be a proxy to certain services, but it does vary depending on the function or the suite app. I hope that answered that question.
It did for me.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah. I think sort of dovetailing off of that, maybe not so much about the actual technical architecture of the suite apps, but you've only got 17 people, but it sounds like you have quite the fleet of suite apps, whether public or not. How do you go about sort of organizing, planning, managing, distributing all of those things? What are the logistics and the challenges that you run into trying to do that with so few relatively people?
Well, I would say that, tailing off of my earlier statements of the ambition, we have suite apps that may not be well distributed, but I still believe are highly valuable and that might live to see a better day. But when it comes to some of the more highly distributed suite apps like Extend Files and some of our industry specific ones or Extend Mobile, we work pretty hard on both organizing documentation, setting up new release information, new functionality and features, and trying to essentially manage those bundles and the distribution of updates in the same ilk as best practices for both NetSuite rollouts and some other larger app providers. So I think if your question is how are we managing the library of suite apps that are so broad with such a small staff, I mean, inevitably we have to apply our focus to the ones that are the most utilized or in the most demand. A discussion earlier was about, well, can you customize on top of the suite apps, right? Or are there things that support what your suite app is doing? And those are where we apply our focus and then try to syndicate a solution based on the services and the things that we're working with clients. So an example is inevitably a lot of people now have file migration projects related to switching over to Extend Files, or maybe it's a file cabinet migration because there's a tiering implication, or they need to move from a SharePoint or a G Drive environment to a non-object storage environment like Azure or AWS, or maybe they even have local files that they need to transition into this type of method. So we wind up performing a lot of work and testing different limits of NetSuite, and when it comes to egress of files back and forth and moving things and reconnecting them. So we've established file cabinet migration routines and repository to repository routines. And when we exercise those, we document the process and our methods. And, we ultimately want them to be reusable for the next request. So we can make it a more efficient process for both ourselves and the client. Now, if you come to us, which some folks have, saying I got 4.5 terabytes of data in my file cabinet and I need to move this out in a month, that's not going to happen because NetSuite doesn't push files out that fast, So it is about planning and understanding these timelines and some of the methodologies. But to get back to your original question, yeah, we work hard to focus in on providing enough clear support and documentation on our website so people can self-serve themselves under common errors. and work with clients closely to make sure that they're successful in achieving the objectives that they want to achieve. I mean, personally, seeing an app in use is a lot more gratifying than I would much rather see an app in use and do it for free or underpaid than to get paid a ton of money and watch it sit on the shelf of a particular customer not being utilized. I feel like we don't get the gratification unless we're seeing it actually being used and being depending upon it, and people developing an affinity for this utility.
And then what about like internally as well? I'm thinking about, most of our audience is going to probably be developers or developer adjacent. So am I, of course. So I'm thinking about the developer who has to sort of jump from app to app to app, with different requests, different features, different support, whatever it might be. How do you manage that? Do you have like patterns that you try to reuse through the apps, or, how do you make sure that your developers can jump from code base to code base without losing a ton of steam in that context switching?
No, that's a great question. And there are recurring themes or certain, I call them like sniper scripts in certain functions, because they're very targeted, but they're have a ton of different applications. So from a developer perspective, we do have some specialization within the organization, like some of our mobile development efforts, or we have specific members who are mobile developers. And then for certain applications that we do integration wise or within the micro vertical, a couple of our developers are very experienced with the nomenclature and the business requirements. So they have the thematic background to what we're working on. And then, yes, we try to keep those patterns consistent. I mean, ultimately, we wish it was one pattern suits all. Sure. But that's not reality, right? But, we'll have certain functionality in an extend files application that we also apply to a web approvals application or an RFQ application, where it's the same fundamental methodology of how we're delivering the function. But it just points to a different record or supports a different update scenario. So, and like I mentioned, our team is certainly differentiated in certain ways to be focused in on whether it be promo specific apps or whether it be extend files, or maybe there's an infrastructure focus that we need to support. So, and we try to cross train. I mean, ultimately, you need to make sure that there's enough knowledge spread amongst the team to be operational under shifts of time and availability. But, we do rely on people taking ownership of certain areas and certain functionality within the team.
Interesting.
Okay. No,
go ahead. So, mine is kind of a very specific question, and it occurred to me while you were talking about, looking for patterns, I guess, between the different apps. I'm just curious, with Extend Mobile, is there an integration between that and Extend Files? Like, can you set up I figured as much. That's very cool. Do you have an example where that's being, like, how you're using that?
Yeah, well, when I mentioned that solar company, right, and taking photographs, so every photograph that's being taken is being qualified with its own custom parameter and pushed in as an extend file. And it was critical for us to give that functionality, because like the simplest of use cases is to pull out your phone, pull up a record, take a photograph, push that into the record and be done. Mm-hmm. Right? So almost like a simple image capture vehicle. So could we have incorporated it into the file cabinet? Most likely. But we, one piece that we do with extend files, which we find critical, is metadata and associating different metadata with your document or your file or your image or whatever. So even straight out of the box, and there's always subsequent workflows and functions that are occurring based on a particular parameter set on that record. So maybe not just for the solar project, but when I pull out my phone and I hit the button to take the photo, I might want to say, this is a picture of the wiring cabinet. And this is a picture of the roof. And this is a picture of, the wire runs. Or, even in a promo perspective, like we might have somebody on the production floor take out a phone and take a picture of that first unit that came off the press. And they want to qualify that as being a distinct first piece photo. And then due to the parameter being set on that particular record, it can orchestrate different workflows or emails or things like that. So even if we push things into the file cabinet, it wouldn't have contextual metadata to be able to perform those functions. So that's kind of why we geared it to be compatible with extend files and plug it in that way.
That's interesting. Eric, did you have a follow-up question?
I did, but it's going to take us back to the previous topic.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned cross-training, and that's something I think every team I've ever encountered and been on struggles with. How do you go about doing that? Are you very intentional and structured about it? Is it a little, well, we hope they do?
Well, I might need to defer to some of my development colleagues, but what he's really tried to foster is the tight communication and staying connected within our tools, whether it be Jira or using some of those pieces to keep everybody. But we publish a lot of internal knowledge bases, and he mixes up the development tasks between the members quite frequently. So everybody's getting a little bit of a taste of what needs to be executed and has some contextual knowledge around what we've built. So I would love tactically to have a few more ways to be intentional about cross-training in that regard. And everybody uses the term as, that's the way to do it, but nobody really knows how to do it. So, I mean, look, even from a functional perspective, we're working through it where, I have inherent knowledge of certain applications and my colleagues have inherent knowledge of those applications. And we're just working to ensure that we can, communicate about these challenges, or if an issue comes up with a particular app, it all boils down to communication, in my opinion, because if you don't ask the question or you don't search our knowledge base, then you're going to just autonomously start coming up with some new idea. And then by the time I hear about it, I'll be like, look, man, we knew that. And here's the article on that. And all you needed to do is ask or look, right? So we're still trying to make it stupid easy to find it on your own, or, don't be so shy. Just reach out on Teams or whatever the communication platform is and ask a question, because there are no bad questions when it comes to trying to figure out, what do we have? How does it work? And what can you do to make it better?
Just a quick time check. We're coming up on the 15-minute mark here already.
Okay. Time flies when you're having fun.
It sure does. Tim, do you have something next?
I want to loop back a little bit to something I said earlier, which is, when I first met you, we were both doing a lot of work in the promotional products industry. And, even back then I saw you as sort of the champion of NetSuite, like as far as that industry goes. And it's been really interesting watching the interest and the adoption of companies that are in that space when it comes to NetSuite. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on all that. Like, it's got to be somewhat rewarding, I hope, to see that, you were always encouraging companies, you should really check out NetSuite, and I think it's finally happening. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I always did think it was a very strong and viable platform for the vertical. I mean, for the companies I worked for, it was very successful in managing and growing their business. But adoption and understanding it was probably, there were other solutions, or it just wasn't present. So yeah, I saw it being a great solution, and even the things we were developing and the methodologies we were developing within it seemed to be quite powerful. But, and maybe that was part of the whole taking the solution provider path and the VAR, like trying to promote that it was a good solution for the industry. But I would say maybe when my thoughts about that or being able to, help deliver it into the industry started to wane is when it started to surge. So, timing wise, but I'm thrilled that there's an acknowledgement of, the solution being viable to run businesses within this vertical, and the adoption is great. I do hope people know that it's not a plug and play, right? And I don't care what business it is. There's no press the button and I'm running it in a day, no matter what SuiteSuccess may say or anything else related to an implementation. It does take a lot of hard work and data management and internal staff taking ownership of it. So, I mean, for anybody, I would think everybody on the call might be already an existing NetSuite customer rather than a prospect. But, for prospects and people who are getting into the ERP, I just always say, look, this is your system. You take ownership of it. If you hire an implementation partner to do the implementation, make sure you have a dedicated resource that understands what they're moving into and can manage it going forward. Too many people say, hey, I expect these guys to do the implementation and they're going to hand me a finished product and all I got to do is use it. And then the next thing you know, they go away and nobody knows how to do anything internally, and you're tethered to a partner for everything. Like, people don't learn how to do save searches. People don't know how to use workbook analytics, or they don't know how to administrate it properly. So I would say, to your question about watching the industry adopt it, it's exciting, but I want people to ensure that they recognize it is not like, hey, I'm jumping on the bandwagon and I'll be running NetSuite and everything will be flowing like a dream scene and I'll be on a beach somewhere while my company runs, on a cloud-based ERP. It's no matter how much a utility we may have produced, it would shorten the timeline for you to be able to achieve a function. It still takes a lot of attention to detail and a lot of internal commitment to be successful with it.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this quite a bit, and it's not an exaggeration when I say it, but of all the different industries that I've worked in, the clients that are in those different industries, I've never seen one as complicated as the promotional products industry. I've joked with you and said, if you can slap a logo on something, they'll sell it and they'll find a way to do it. It's crazy. And so, when I think about the success that you've had in that industry, and, it makes it even more impressive to me. You were a CIO of a promotional products, I think a distributor, right? Or was it
a supplier, actually? So, I mean, the promotional products industry is, my best frenemy at times, right? Because it is very complex. I have some very brilliant friends who work in quantum computing, and when they started to learn about the promotional products industry, they're like, man, that stuff's hard. Right. So, it is by no means a quick snap and I get it. It's not picking one thing off the shelf, sticking in a box and sending it out the door. Yeah. On the flip side, though, it is really built on the fundamentals of every business, right? Like we talked about this. There is importing and warehousing and CRM and logistics, and then there's production and shop floor, and then there's shipping, or if you're on a distributor side, there's e-commerce, and there's agency types of marketing and project management. So it really does incorporate all of the core practices that exist in different businesses around. And then the other thing is that the margins are highly competitive. And so, you've got all this complexity matched with lower general margins or smaller orders, makes for a very tough scenario, right? Because the budgets aren't as big as, a potential unicorn or funded or things like that. So the challenge, which is what brings me all the way back to why NetSuite was a good solution for the industry, is that there's a lot of labor within the industry, lots of communications back and forth between a supplier and a distributor, because it's a two-channel type of business structure. So to be able to reduce the amount of friction between a distributor and a supplier and do those integrations and make things flow a little bit better, ultimately reduces the labor and then translates into more margin, because that margin gets eroded with all of the headaches of sending a logo back and forth, asking somebody to approve a proof, having to follow up on that proof approval, going back into the system to say it's been approved and moving it into production flows. So, you know, we're really here to shave. I always say, if I could shave seconds, that's great. If I could shave minutes, that's amazing. If I could shave hours, then you're completely like owning it at that point. So where can we shave time or repurpose people's efforts so they can focus in on generating more business or improving a process rather than doing administrative slag work?
Yeah. So I just have one last comment and one last question. It seems to me, like, in knowing you personally and also just from this conversation, that it appears to me that one of the keys to your success is that you started as a user and you have kind of, again, taken that path from being a user all the way to now running a NetSuite business. But all along the way, it seems to me you've always had the mindset of, what does the user need? How can we help? Right? You've never, from what I can tell, you've never disconnected from that. And I guess my question to you is, do you think that's really the secret to your success with eXtendTech? Because it sure looks like it to me.
I mean, I feel like it's a huge contributor, differentiator, right? I mean, I was struggling with a particular function, or, you know, a boss would say, hey, I want to measure labor on that machine over there. How can we do that? And getting down into it and putting your hands on the machine and meeting the operators and seeing what they're doing from an analog, you know, stroke. Do they have an employee badge on their waist with a barcode on it? Because if they do, I'll scan that barcode and we'll, you know who's doing the work, right? Yeah. So I do feel thankful, and sometimes I feel like I miss being on the field. And when I'm working with clients, I make sure we're on the field, right? And we're on the production floor, and we're meeting the folks who are producing those goods or shipping those goods or picking those goods, and we walk it through with them. And that's where, to me, none of it works unless I can see it working with my own two eyes and see somebody else doing it too. Because it's one thing if I can do it, it's another thing if you could do it. Right. So I don't know if that's the secret to the success, but I know no other way. I feel like I'd be an imposter if I didn't do it that way, right? So if I think it sucks for myself and I'm going to want to fix it to make it better for myself, or what's the term? You work really hard to be as lazy as possible. So, you know, all that effort to make it easy is really the goal.
Yep.
But you can't do that unless you understand what you are making easy. You can't hide from your users and what they're doing, no matter how much we developers might want to sometimes. You can't hide from them. You need to understand what they're doing so that you can't automate or improve or optimize anything unless you understand it first. And you need to understand the inputs and the outputs in order to do that effectively and efficiently.
Yeah, and I mean, look, sometimes developers are like, look, you're just coming up with these edge cases that we need to accommodate for, because we all know about edge cases and how that disrupts your patterns, right? But, you know, the reality is there's the theoretical edge case that I can conceive in my brain, and then maybe should we evaluate for that? And then there's the actual, like, you know, 10% of the time it goes this way. So being in tune to what's happening on the floor, seeing the patterns that are occurring and solving for those patterns, and then knowing where the exceptions are, you can't do it unless you see it. And I guess asking, you know, your question, Tim, I find that there's things I can accomplish when I'm on site that I can't do remotely. And there's things I can do remotely that I can't accomplish on site. So that really brings to the balance of being remote versus being in person, because to watch users physically interact with things. Even when I'm watching the screen, I'm like, hey, that guy copied that, but I think he had an additional space. And when we're downstream to see if that worked, did he include that blank space in the string that it's going to mess up the functionality? Like, you miss those things when you are talking remotely on how does somebody perform their job. But if you can witness how they're doing it, then that allows you to think, okay, well, maybe a 1D scanner comes in better than a camera, for example. Like, just making those decisions on the solution is dependent upon what is that user physically expecting to do. And you can't do that without being on the field, at least at some point.
All right, we just have a few minutes left. So real quickly, I'm going to thank Salto again, and then I'll give you all a chance to close it out, wrap it up. So once again, this episode is hosted, of course, and sponsored by Salto. So if you're struggling to manage, track, deploy your NetSuite changes, go check out salto.io. They've got a pretty powerful DevOps platform for helping you do that sort of thing. Thank you, Salto. And yeah, how should we wrap it up, gentlemen?
Well, Sam, thanks again for taking the time to do this. I hope that everyone that did join us live and those who watch this later, come away from this with inspiration, because it's really cool to hear your story and see, just your path. And I'm so happy to see all the success that you and the eXtendTech team have had. It's very cool. It seems so genuine. And again, that's kind of why I was asking the question about, like, do you think the key to your success is that you haven't really lost touch with really where you came from in terms of the NetSuite space? It's pretty cool. So thank you and congrats.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys. No final zinger questions. Like, I think I remember in your SuiteScript Stories, you throw some kind of random closer out at everybody, but yeah, it's okay. I mean, I feel comfortable if not put on this spot.
I was going to ask you a question about the cache module in SuiteScript, but we'll do that on the follow-up.
I have to go now. No, I'm just kidding.
How about you, Eric? Anything else, or be good?
I don't think so, unless I mean, Sam, is there something you would like people to know about that's maybe not eXtendTech or NetSuite related? I think that's usually what we ask, something that's a little bit unrelated. I guess we're rusty.
That's okay. I recognize that. I'll take advantage of your rustiness in this particular context. But no, I mean, the only thing I'd say is I appreciate you guys always have for that, as I mentioned in the beginning of the call, the community and being able to pull it together. So if there's anything I can do to contribute, I'll always be an audience member and always be in support of it. And yeah, thanks for thinking of me and giving me the time to talk to you guys a little bit. It's always been a little bit of a dream of mine. So appreciate you making that come true.
I know that our final question should be is, how can people learn about what you do, about your company? Where should they go? But there's we are rusty, aren't Tim. We?
No, I mean, look, we are at eXtendTech.net. I always said that we're better at building things than talking about them or promoting them, right? So, while eXtendTech.net has some general content and some of the offers we make, we've got a pretty deep library. So if there's if anybody has any questions or wants to communicate or have a conversation, you can always reach out to us. I'm Sam at eXtendTech.net or info at eXtendTech.net, but check us out on the web and send us a message via the website, and we'll certainly have a conversation. We'd love to hear what some of the challenges are and see if there's a compatible solution that we can help with.
So just one last thing too, and I promise we'll really wrap this up. If you are interested in checking out some of what eXtendTech is doing with their mobile app, you have a YouTube channel, I think, where, I think Dino, one of your team members there, your partner in crime, is doing some of those demos, and they're really pretty cool. So just check them out. Go to YouTube and search for eXtendTech. And
And we're working on more use case definitions. So we've been doing some really cool things with picking and warehouse and shipping and everything else. So hopefully we'll be able to get that content out there and share it with you guys so you can tell us how terrible it is or something.
Well, keep up the good work, Sam, and thanks again for doing this. And
Thanks, guys.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. We can't build that community without folks like you and people in the chat attending and participating. So we appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
see you later.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.